I thought it was a bear. That's the explanation I kept coming back to. Even after I left the mountain, even after I stopped taking calls from the district office, even after I sold most of my camping gear and swore I'd never spend another night alone in the Appalachian backcountry. A bear made sense. A bear was something I could understand. The problem is that bears don't do what I saw that night. My name is Ryan Mercer. I'm 39 years old, and in the fall of 2023, I was working as a wildlife survey contractor in eastern Kentucky. Most of my job involved long hikes through public land, collecting trail camera data, documenting animal activity, and checking population markers for black bears and elk. It wasn't exciting work. Mostly, it meant walking through miles of forest, carrying too much equipment, and spending hours looking at photos of raccoons. I'd been doing it for nearly 6 years, long enough to know the difference between a deer and a bear before I even saw tracks, long enough to know which sounds belonged in the woods and which didn't. At least I thought I did. The assignment came in late October, a section of mountain forest near the Kentucky-Virginia border. Remote, mostly undeveloped, the kind of place where roads gradually stop being roads and become suggestions. I was supposed to spend 5 days there checking a series of wildlife cameras that had gone offline. Nothing unusual. Equipment fails all the time. Usually it was batteries, sometimes storm damage. Occasionally somebody stole one. I loaded my truck and left before sunrise. The farther I drove, the emptier everything became. Gas stations disappeared, cell service weakened, traffic vanished. By the time I reached the forest access road, I hadn't passed another vehicle in almost an hour. The mountain sat under a blanket of low clouds. Dark hardwood forests covered the slopes in every direction. The last stretch of road wound through narrow valleys where sunlight barely reached the ground. I remember thinking how quiet everything felt. Not peaceful, just quiet, like something was missing. Around noon, I reached a small ranger station near the edge of the survey zone. It wasn't much, just a weathered building and a maintenance shed. One truck sat outside. An older ranger named Carl was sitting on the porch drinking coffee. He looked to be in his 60s. Weathered face, grey beard, the kind of man who looked like he'd spent his entire life outdoors. I introduced myself and explained why I was there. He nodded, asked which camera sites I was checking. I showed him the map. His expression changed slightly when he saw one of the locations. Site 14, a camera positioned deep inside a section of forest known locally as Hollow Ridge. That one's been acting up for a while, he said. I asked what he meant. He shrugged. Just keeps going dead. Batteries? Maybe. The way he said it didn't sound convincing. I laughed and told him I'd figure it out. For a moment he didn't answer. Then he said something strange. Don't stay up there after dark. I remember smiling. People say things like that all the time in remote areas. Usually they're talking about rough terrain, hunters, bears, nothing mysterious. I asked him why. He stared toward the mountains. Just don't. That was all he said. No explanation, no story, just those 2 words. I thanked him and headed out. The trail climbed steadily through dense hardwood forest, oak, maple, hickory. The leaves covered everything in shades of orange and gold. Beautiful country, the kind of place people drive hundreds of miles to photograph. By late afternoon, I'd checked 3 camera sites, all normal. Dead batteries, nothing unusual. The 4th site took longer to reach. The terrain became steeper, rockier. The trail gradually disappeared until I was navigating mostly by GPS. By the time I reached Hollow Ridge, the sun was already beginning to sink. The camera was mounted to a large oak tree overlooking a narrow valley. At first glance, it looked fine. No storm damage, no signs of vandalism. I opened the housing and checked the batteries, fully charged. That didn't make sense. The unit should have been working. I removed the memory card and inserted a fresh one. Then I sat on a fallen log to review the footage. Most wildlife surveys are boring. Hours of empty forest, occasional deer, turkeys, coyotes. The first several hundred photos were exactly that. Then I noticed something odd. The same section of forest appeared repeatedly at nearly identical times, usually around 2 or 3 in the morning. Nothing visible, just empty woods, yet the camera kept triggering. Again and again and again, hundreds of times. I zoomed in. No animals, no movement, no obvious explanation, just dark trees. For a moment I assumed insects were causing false triggers. Then I noticed something else. The timestamps. Every burst of photos ended abruptly, as if whatever triggered the camera had suddenly disappeared, not moved away. Disappeared, I frowned. Probably a malfunction. That explanation satisfied me for about 10 seconds. Then I reached the final image. The photograph was taken 3 nights earlier. At 2:43 a.m., the frame showed the same section of forest, same trees, same darkness. At first I thought it was another empty image. Then I noticed 2 small reflections near the edge of the frame. Eyes, animal eyes, nothing unusual. Trail cameras capture eyes constantly. The strange part was the height. The reflections appeared almost 7 feet above the ground. I stared at the image for several seconds. Maybe the animal was standing on a fallen log. Maybe the terrain sloped upward. There were plenty of explanations. I closed the viewer and packed my gear. The sun was disappearing behind the ridge. I needed to move. My campsite sat nearly 2 miles away. The hike back should have taken about 40 minutes. Instead, it took nearly 2 hours. Because about halfway down the mountain, I started hearing something behind me. Not footsteps. Not exactly. More like movement. Branches shifting. Leaves crunching. Always just outside visual range. Whenever I stopped walking, the sound stopped too. I told myself it was a deer. The mountains were full of them. But after the 4th time it happened, I began checking over my shoulder every few minutes. The forest had become noticeably darker. Long shadows stretched between the trees. Visibility dropped. The feeling of being watched settled over me slowly. Not panic, just awareness. The same feeling you get when somebody enters a room behind you. Eventually I reached camp, a small clearing beside an abandoned logging road. I built a fire, cooked dinner, made coffee. By the time darkness fully arrived, I had almost convinced myself the entire thing was in my head. Then I noticed something. The woods had gone silent. No insects, no birds, no distant animal calls, nothing. Just the crackling of the fire. And somewhere beyond the edge of the clearing, a single branch snapped, loud, deliberate, close. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the tree line. Nothing. The beam illuminated rows of trunks and fallen leaves. No movement, no eyes, no animals. After a few minutes, I laughed at myself. Probably a deer, maybe a bear. I sat back down, the fire popped, the darkness pressed against the clearing. And that's when I heard it. A low growl. Not from the woods, from directly behind my tent. Close enough that I could feel it in my chest. I froze. Every instinct told me there was a bear nearby. Slowly I stood and aimed my flashlight toward the sound. The beam swept across the tent, across the grass, across the darkness beyond. Then it stopped. Because something was standing there, and for one brief second I thought it was a bear, until it stood up. For a second my brain refused to process what I was seeing. The flashlight beam trembled slightly in my hands. The figure stood just beyond the edge of the clearing, maybe 30 yards away. Dark, massive, covered in black fur. At first glance it looked exactly like a black bear. The shape was right, the size was right. Everything about it screamed bear. Then it rose higher and kept rising. The front of its body lifted. Its shoulders straightened. The head came up, and suddenly it wasn't standing like a bear anymore. It was standing like a man. I wish I could tell you exactly how tall it was. I can't. Distance plays tricks on you at night. Fear makes things bigger, but it looked enormous. Far taller than any person I'd ever met. The thing remained motionless, not charging, not growling, not threatening, just watching. The flashlight reflected faintly from its eyes. Yellow, not glowing. Just reflecting light, like an animal. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then my survival instincts finally kicked in. I backed toward the truck, slowly, keeping the flashlight trained on it. The figure never approached, never made a sound. It simply stood there at the edge of the clearing, watching me. The moment I reached the truck door, I jumped inside and locked it. The engine started immediately. Headlights flooded the clearing. I looked toward the tree line. Nothing. The figure was gone. Just gone. No crashing through brush. No running. No movement. The tree line stood empty. I spent the rest of the night inside the truck. Engine off. Doors locked. Every few minutes I scanned the woods with a spotlight. Nothing appeared. Around dawn, exhaustion finally caught up with me. I drifted off for maybe 30 minutes. When I woke, sunlight was filtering through the windshield. The clearing looked harmless again. Normal. Embarrassingly normal. I stepped outside. The first thing I checked was the edge of the clearing where I'd seen the figure. The ground was soft from recent rain. If something that large had been standing there, there should have been tracks. There were, just not the kind I expected. At first I thought they belonged to a bear. Large impressions, deep, heavy. Then I noticed the stride length. The spacing was wrong. The prints continued for roughly 40 yards before disappearing into rocky terrain. Some impressions looked vaguely bear-like, others looked almost human. I took photographs, measurements, GPS coordinates. The more I examined them, the less confident I became. Nothing matched cleanly, nothing made sense. By noon, I'd convinced myself the previous night had been a misunderstanding, a bear standing briefly on its hind legs. Simple, perfectly reasonable. That explanation lasted until I reached camera site 15. The unit was mounted approximately a mile north of Hollow Ridge. Unlike the previous camera, this one wasn't dead. It was smashed, not vandalized, destroyed. The mounting strap had been torn apart, the housing cracked, the lens shattered. The camera itself lay nearly 20 feet away in a patch of ferns. I crouched beside it. The damage was strange. I've seen bears damage cameras before. Usually they're curious. They bite them, bat them around, leave tooth marks. This looked different. The housing appeared twisted, almost as if someone had grabbed it and pulled. I collected the memory card. Back at camp, I reviewed the footage. Most of it was normal. Days of wildlife activity. Then the final sequence appeared. The timestamp showed 2:18 a.m., 3 nights earlier. The camera activated. Empty forest. Another image. Empty forest, another. Then something entered the frame. Only partially. A shoulder. Dark fur. Massive. The figure stood so close to the camera that most of its body extended beyond view. The next image showed less. The next image showed nothing. And then the footage ended. No destruction captured. No explanation. Just gone. That night I considered leaving. Honestly, I should have. The rational part of my brain had started losing ground. Too many odd things. Too many unanswered questions. But I was only 2 days from completing the assignment. And the longer I stared at the photographs, the more determined I became to find a normal explanation. People always think curiosity disappears when fear shows up. It doesn't. Sometimes curiosity gets stronger. Around 11 p.m., I heard howling. Not wolf howling, not coyote howling. I've heard both countless times. This sound was deeper, longer. It echoed across the valleys, a mournful sound that seemed to carry for miles. Another howl answered from somewhere farther up the mountain, then another. For nearly 20 minutes, the sounds moved through the ridges surrounding camp. Eventually, silence returned. I slept poorly. At 2:17 a.m., I woke to something brushing the side of my tent, a slow scraping sound, like coarse fabric dragging across nylon. I lay completely still. The sound came again, long, slow, deliberate. Every muscle in my body tightened. The scraping moved around the tent. One side, then another, circling. I reached for my flashlight. The sound stopped immediately. Silence, absolute silence. For nearly 5 minutes, then 3 heavy footsteps crossed the clearing. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Each one sounded impossibly heavy. I unzipped the tent just enough to look outside. Moonlight illuminated the clearing. Nothing moved. No animals, no people. Yet the feeling remained. The certainty that something stood nearby, watching, waiting. I didn't sleep again. At first light, I packed everything. The assignment wasn't finished. I didn't care. I wanted off the mountain as quickly as possible. The hike back toward the ranger station took most of the morning. Several times I thought I heard movement paralleling me through the woods. Each time I stopped, it stopped too. The same pattern, again and again. By noon I reached the station. Carl was sitting on the porch exactly where I'd left him, coffee in hand, as though he'd never moved. He looked at me, then at my truck, then at my face. "You saw it," he said. Not a question, a statement. I remember feeling anger. Relief, too, mostly anger, because the way he said it told me he already knew. I asked him what he meant. He remained silent for a long moment. Then he sighed. "You're not the first." I asked him what it was. Bear? Man? Something else? He shook his head. "I don't know." And for the first time I believed him, because he genuinely looked uncertain, not scared, not dramatic, just tired. Like somebody who'd spent years trying to explain something that refused to fit into any category. Before I left, he told me one final thing. There had been reports in that area for decades. Hunters, Hikers, survey crews, campers, most described the same pattern. Strange movement, being followed, howling. Something large standing upright at the edge of clearings. Nobody ever brought back proof, at least nothing convincing. I drove off the mountain shortly afterward. The farther I got from Hollow Ridge, the better I felt. Cell service returned, traffic returned, normal life returned. Within a week, I had almost convinced myself the whole thing was exaggeration. Fear, stress, a bear viewed under poor lighting conditions. The explanation made sense, until 3 months later. I was organizing equipment photos from the assignment when I noticed something I'd missed. One image from camera site 14, one I'd barely looked at. The photograph showing those reflective eyes near the edge of the frame. I zoomed in, then zoomed further. The eyes weren't the only thing visible. There was a shape, a silhouette, standing partially behind a tree, tall, broad-shouldered, upright, watching the camera, watching the exact spot where I would eventually set up camp. The timestamp showed the image had been taken 3 days before I arrived. I stared at that photograph for a long time. Then I closed the file. I've never opened it again. Maybe it was a bear, maybe it wasn't. Maybe there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for everything that happened on that mountain. I'd like to believe that. I really would. But every October, when the leaves start changing and the mountains turn orange again, I find myself thinking about Hollow Ridge. About those tracks, about the howling, about the thing standing at the edge of the clearing, and one thought always comes back. The same thought. The thing that still bothers me after all this time. When I first saw it, my flashlight caught it completely off guard. I know that because I watched it react. I watched it freeze, like it hadn't expected anyone to notice it, like it thought it was hidden. And if that's true, then the most frightening part isn't that it was there, it's that it had probably been there long before I ever saw it.